by David Chalmers from NYU.
Okay, last day. Very exciting. It's been amazing, at least from the week of it that I've got to come along to. Thanks so much to Shiri and to Nate for organizing all this, to Lenore for putting together a Consciousness Day, which of course is going to be the high point of the whole thing, and everybody else. So I was trying to figure out what to talk about. I mean, I've been doing some work on language models lately that's not that much on consciousness, and some work on consciousness that's not that much on language models. But I thought, well, there's kind of like, this is Consciousness Day, so I'm kind of expected to talk about consciousness. And come on, everyone talks about language. That's what we talk about here, is language models. So I figure I pretty much have to talk about that intersection between language models and consciousness, which is something I've been thinking about for a little while. Some of you might have seen some version of this, of these thoughts before, but especially the overarching question of, could it be that the current language models are conscious, or that their successors could be conscious, and what might the conditions and the criteria be for that to happen? I'll start with maybe the first half or so will be a bit of background on consciousness, figuring that we have a lot of consciousness talks today, and it's not everybody's area. In the second half, I'll talk about language models. So defining consciousness, at least as I use the term, consciousness is more or less interchangeable with subjective experience. There's this nice formulation due to my philosophy colleague, Tom Nagel, that says a being is conscious if there's something it's like to be that being. That is, if it has subjective experience. And his classic example is the case of a bat. Intuitively, we don't know what it's like to be a bat, but there's a very good chance that there's something it's like to be a bat. From the bat's perspective, it has some kind of subjective experience. If there's something it's like to be a bat, then the bat is conscious in the relevant sense. If there's nothing it's like to be this microphone, then the microphone is not conscious. So this is, philosophers and scientists sometimes use the term phenomenal consciousness to distinguish consciousness in the sense of subjective experience from anything else. Conscious experience, so understood, is very rich, comes in many facets and varieties, including but not limited to sensory experience, say the experience of seeing colors and shapes, hearing music, affective experience, feeling pain, which we're going to hear a lot about from Manuel, feeling sad, and so on. Cognitive experience, the experience of thought, thinking hard, doing mathematics in one's head, agentive experience, deciding to act, the experience of action, and cutting across all these things, there's self-consciousness, consciousness of oneself, which I don't take to be required for a phenomenal consciousness. In some simple animals, there might be subjective experience without self-consciousness, but which has aspects that cut across all these things. People use the word consciousness for many different things. The term can refer to what my colleague Ned Block calls access consciousness. Roughly, a bit of information or a mental state is access conscious if the cognitive system has access to it. That is, if the relevant information is accessible for things like verbal report, for reasoning, and for action. That's, heavily intermingled in some ways with phenomenal consciousness, but the two are conceptually distinct, at least. There's reflective consciousness, where mental states are introspectable. And I hear lately we've just had all this talk on situational awareness, which has got everybody very excited, which seems to come down to some kind of knowledge of one's position in the world, both by humans or by AI systems. This is kind of a broad sense of awareness where it comes to something like knowledge, which is certainly one use of terms like consciousness and awareness. But those aren't the sensors I'm using. It's also worth noting that, especially since we're in the week on high-level intelligence, is that consciousness is not the same as high-level intelligence and doesn't require high-level intelligence. I mean, most people think that that mice are conscious, that birds and fish may well be conscious, and they don't need to have human-level intelligence to be conscious like that. Consciousness can be very simple, can go along with feeling pain or seeing red, which I guess those things I guess must have been dealt with in the first week of the workshop on low-level intelligence. So I think consciousness in its way cuts across low-level and high-level intelligence. But once you get to high-level intelligence, once you get to the cognitive realm of thought and language and so on, it may well be that brings along distinctive kinds of conceptually articulated consciousness. Okay, but I'll focus on phenomenal consciousness, subjective experience. When it comes to consciousness, we can distinguish between various problems. The so-called easy problems of consciousness go along with roughly with explaining certain matters of objective functioning, so mechanisms of access, of integration, of discrimination, of information, ultimately resulting in behavior. And for these problems, what makes them, quote, easy isn't that they're trivial, it's rather that we've got a standard method for trying to explain them, which is roughly specify a mechanism, a neural or a computational mechanism to perform those functions, specify a rich enough mechanism that performs the functions of access, integration, discrimination. We've explained those things. The so-called hard problem of consciousness is, well, the two-word version of it is just explain consciousness, explain, subjective experience. Usually it's understood in somewhat more detail as explain how and why physical processes in the organism give rise to subjective experience. And what makes it hard is that the standard methods here of explaining, say, objective functions by specifying a mechanism seem to leave an explanatory gap. You can explain all those objective quasi-behavioral functions, and you still seem to have this further question: why is all that accompanied by subjective experience? So standard neuroscience and cognitive science seems to leave a gap there, which is one of the things that makes this problem especially puzzling. While I'm outlining these problems, there's another one I'm fond of, which is the meta problem. Explain why we say or think that we're conscious, and why we say or think that it's a problem. I mean, the fact that we're conscious, that's a mysterious experiential fact about us, but the fact that we say we're conscious, that's a behavioral fact about us. And in a way, the meta problem is open to the same kind of explanation as the easy problem. So there's a really interesting research program for anyone in at least trying to explain these intuitions that we're conscious, and it seems to pose a problem. For some people, that leads to the philosophical view of illusionism, where we explain away consciousness as a kind of illusion. I don't think it has to do that, but that's, I think, an interesting and important research program in its own right, but one I won't focus on today. Today, I'm just going to be taking for granted that consciousness straightforwardly exists and try to connect it to everything else. So one of the other problems, which is particularly central when it comes to AI, is the classic philosophical problem of other minds, usually understood as how can you know that another being has a mind, or in this case, more specifically, how can you know when another being is conscious? This already arises just for other ordinary people around you. We each know that we ourselves are conscious. When it comes to other people, we can't observe their phenomenal consciousness directly, so there's at least an epistemological issue there. Once you move away from normal adult humans, things get all the more complicated. Claudia is going to talk about infants, neurological patients with no capacity to report. How can we know whether they're conscious? Non-human animals, cerebral organoids, and of course the case we're particularly concerned with today, which is the problem of other AI minds. How can we know whether an AI system is conscious. And one way to make this contrast is say basically there are two hypotheses here. A given AI system with very sophisticated behavior, including but not limited to language models, first they could be conscious, or second, they could be something like what philosophers call a philosophical zombie, producing that kind of behavior without consciousness. So this was actually illustrated in an episode of Star Trek, where remember Commander Data was on trial, and they had to determine whether he's conscious or not. I think they went through three things. They said yes, he's intelligent. Yes, he is in some sense self-aware. Then they go to the third question, the question of consciousness, and they actually dropped it. They never addressed it. They said, now what if he is conscious, even in the slightest degree? Then he has all these rights. But here's an illustration of the hypothesis that Data is conscious, which clearly the TV series favors. He's having a lot of sensory consciousness, affective consciousness, cognitive consciousness. And the alternative is that all that's going on, without any consciousness, that Data is a zombie. The zombie hypothesis is not very far from it's closely related to the stochastic parrot hypothesis that says that, I take it, that language models do all this processing, produce very sophisticated behavior without understanding anything. The exact relation depends on the relation between consciousness and understanding. Anyway, so interestingly, the philosophical zombie hypothesis in its extreme version is a far out philosophical thought experiment, but it's used for philosophical purposes. But it is interesting that actually it's very much a live hypothesis when it comes to these AI systems, which are producing human-like behavior, and for which there's this very clear question of whether they're conscious or not. And it seems that actually, at least when it comes to current language models, the dominant money is on them not being conscious, but who knows where this is going. So a lot of this then raises questions about what kind of evidence we might have for consciousness in other people, in animals and AI systems, and whether all this could develop tests for consciousness, which I think we'll be hearing about on and off today. I mean, the gold standard in normal adult human beings for consciousness is verbal report. Find out what someone's conscious of, you ask them, and if there's no reason to believe otherwise, then you take their word for it. One way of, I think for a long time people thought, okay, verbal reports are, you can't use them in some cases, which makes it difficult. Non-human animals, infants, organoids, we don't have verbal reports to use. That's not the problem when it comes to language models. We have many, verbal reports from language models. The worry with language models is that verbal reports are unreliable because we know these systems have been trained to imitate human speech, which contains many reports of consciousness, and maybe the reports can be explained away that way. Likewise, a lot of people have proposed, testing people's intuition specifically about consciousness, finding it puzzling, finding it, qualitative or unified, see if AI systems might do that. But, likewise, basically for any kind of verbal behavior, there's the worry that there's an alternative explanation of that verbal behavior without consciousness due to the training of language models. Even the Turing test, which I'm still inclined to give some significant prima facie weight when it comes to consciousness, is, as we've seen, very controversial as a guide to consciousness. And basically all the behavioral markers that we have get thrown into question a little bit on these systems which are trained to imitate human behavior. Okay, so if not behavior, what else do we have? Yeah?
Consciousness doesn't necessarily have much to do with intelligence and that animals are conscious, etc. And now I heard you say that, stochastic parrots, that's related to whether LLMs are conscious and whether they're really reasoning and intelligent and so on. So can you disambiguate that for me?
Sure. I mentioned that not all forms of consciousness are tied to intelligence, so perception and pain seem not to be. But I also mentioned that there are forms of consciousness, cognitive consciousness, tied to thinking, reasoning, and language, which may be more closely tied to intelligence. So I guess when it comes to stochastic parrots, the relevant feature is understanding, and at least some people think one condition on genuine understanding is having some kind of experience of understanding, which would probably be a kind of cognitive experience, so one of those higher level forms of consciousness. Anyway, I didn't mean to be making overly strong claims about the relationship between stochastic parrots and zombies or consciousness and understanding, just that there are connections there to be drawn, and at least some of the people putting forward the stochastic parrot view, I think, do so because they find it particularly hard to believe that these beings could be conscious and hold that as a requirement for understanding. But okay, behavioral tests called into question. Okay, what else can we use? Neural markers of consciousness are useful, both human beings and neurological patients in non-human animals. Not terribly useful when it comes to language models because they don't have any neurons. They may have artificial neurons, but that's a different thing. At the very least, focusing on those brings us into the territory of computational markers of consciousness, or broadly, algorithmic markers of consciousness, of which there are not a lot of really uncontroversial ones, but one central thought here is if we develop good enough theories of consciousness, and we've got some of these already, these can give us potential computational markers of consciousness, which we can use then as a guide to consciousness in AI systems. So one way of thinking about the methodology here is at least start with the first person case, develop an account of what correlates with consciousness in the relatively uncontroversial cases, develop theories of consciousness, which we can then use as markers of consciousness in other cases, including the AI case. So yeah, there are a bunch of theories of consciousness out there, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of them as the day goes along. I've listed here 6 philosophical theories of consciousness, broadly philosophical theories of its nature, and 6, quote, scientific theories of consciousness tied more closely to some empirical details about brains or algorithms and so on. And they roughly match each other one to one. So there's the philosophical view of functionalism, says, consciousness is broadly speaking tied to certain computations performing certain functions. And one classic functionalist theory in the scientific case is the global workspace theory of consciousness, postulating a computational global workspace that makes information available for all kinds of purposes. It's basically a theory of access consciousness, but then postulates that can explain, or at least correlate with, phenomenal consciousness. There are forms of representationalism tied to consciousness is tied to representing the world in the right way, or to representing one's mind in the right way. A couple of scientific theory corresponding to those are the local recurrency theory due to Victor Lama, which basically says consciousness involves the right kind of recurrent first-order representation of the world, at least in the case of vision. And there's the higher-order theories, which say that consciousness is all about having adequate certain kinds of models or representations of one's own mental states. Megan has done interesting work in this area, and I take it we'll be talking about something in that vicinity. There's also the philosophical view of illusionism, which I touched on already, of which perhaps the best worked out version of scientifically is Michael Graziano's attention schema theory, that says basically we've got all these internal schemas modeling our minds, our attention, our perception, indeed our consciousness, and some parts of them may be illusory, in particular the part that suggests to us that consciousness has these special ineffable properties on Graziano's view may be illusory. There are also dualist views, say consciousness is wholly separate from the physical, which have some quantum mechanical version these days. There are panpsychist views that say consciousness is everywhere, of which perhaps at least the best known, at least near relative of this view, is integrated information theory that says consciousness is basically almost everywhere there's integrated information. There's a nice paper recently by Patrick Butlin, Rob Long, and a bunch of colleagues on trying to bring to bear insights from some of the leading computational theories of consciousness to the question of AI consciousness. Megan's a co-author on that one. I took my name off this one because I couldn't go along with everything. But there's a shorter version of this one that may be coming out. Hopefully, will be coming out shortly. That I'm still on. And yeah, but anyway, this paper is a very nice example of trying to take the best insights from our scientific theories of human consciousness and applying those to AI consciousness. Of course, there's always a question of to what extent the generalization goes through, but this paper is a very nice place to start. There's a broad program I favor, which is the general program of trying to find what we might call, say, psychophysical laws connecting physical processing in brains and elsewhere with consciousness, with a program of something like develop really the best specifications we can, perhaps mathematical specifications of the structure of consciousness, a program that Lenore and Manuel are very invested in. Formulate and test hypotheses about mapping physical structures, computational structures to phenomenal structures, maybe based on the cases we know best, like the normal human case, eventually develop principles, and eventually try to develop fundamental principles that underlie all this, and then when the theory is sufficiently mature, apply it to AI systems. We don't really have any theories that do this right now. Maybe in some ways the closest is integrated information theory, which tries to develop mathematical descriptions of consciousness and to develop potential mathematical connection between informational processes and consciousness. I think it's not very well grounded in the evidence as it stands, but it's a nice example of a theory that takes this mathematical form. So why should we care about AI consciousness? Well, there's a few reasons to care. One reason you might care is you might think, well, conscious systems will be reflective and smart and dangerous, and that may well be true, although we don't really understand the function of consciousness well enough to adjudicate that matter right now. But one central reason to care is philosophical or an ethical reason, which is conscious systems plausibly have moral status. If fish are conscious, can experience pain and so on, then at least to some degree, it matters how we treat them. And the same would go for AI. If an AI system is conscious, it matters how we treat them. Now, okay, if it turns out if an AI system is merely conscious like a fish, then we don't treat fish that well. So maybe the impact of that would be limited. If, on the other hand, it turns out AI systems have human-like consciousness, then arguably, at least, they matter to roughly the degree that humans matter, which is a lot. And if we develop AI systems, even successors of these language models, which are in fact conscious in a human-like way, but we continue to treat AI systems as a mere tool, as we do today. We don't give any significant weight to the concerns of the system itself, then this could easily potentially lead to a moral catastrophe where there are beings which are conscious, which have moral status, but we treat as having none. And we've been in that situation before. I think that's very much a situation that would be desirable to avoid. And of course, this does make the question of whether AI systems are conscious and under what conditions very important. We might, for example, want to avoid even creating conscious AI systems if it's going to lead potentially to that kind of moral catastrophe. It's going to become, I think, a practical or legal question before too long. This could come from a number of different directions. But one natural direction is to thinking about social AI and people developing language models or their successors, which act as their companions, maybe eventually in an embodied form or not. And presumably it's going to happen at some point that some people are going to want to demand rights for their AI companions. I don't know, give them property and say they have a right not to be terminated and so on. At some point, this will approach courts and legislatures, which are going to have to make some decisions about this. And I think these courts and legislatures are going to need some philosophical and scientific help. We're not going to be able to ignore those decisions as, like a scientist, even, or an engineer can say, that's a philosophical question, not my domain. But at some point, it's going to become, at the very least, a moral question, which is going to require, and a legal question, which is going to require a lot of help. So I'm very much in favor of this, this idea that the responsible development of AI agenda needs to include consciousness research put forward by the Association of Mathematical Consciousness Science, which Lenore and Manuel have been founders of. And when it comes to language models specifically, I mean, okay, what's on the pro side? I mean, I think it's limited so far, but their impressive behavioral abilities carry at least some weight. They're not that far from passing the Turing test, which has often been put forward as a prima facie indication of consciousness. They show signs of very domain general abilities, reasoning about many domains, and domain general use of information is often regarded as a sign of consciousness. I think, 2 decades ago, if someone had told us that we had language models, we'd have AI systems with these abilities, I think, and it didn't tell us anything else about them, then, I think most of us would have thought, okay, this is at least prima facie suggestive of something like consciousness in these systems. Now, maybe that evidence can be or has been defeated by something else we know, maybe what we know about their architecture, maybe something we know about their training, for example, the fact they're trained to imitate, maybe that defeats that evidence. But I think this is at least some reason, initial reason to take the hypothesis seriously. On the con side, I think there's a whole bunch of different factors that might make different people worry or doubt whether language models are currently conscious, and even whether their successors might be. So I think of this in terms of potential X factors, which are criteria for consciousness. Some people take to be a necessary condition for consciousness, and that language models lack, or criteria that they fail. I mean, one very natural candidate here is biology. Some people think, like my colleague Ned Block thinks consciousness requires a certain kind of carbon-based biology or biochemistry. Language models lack that, and therefore can't be conscious. Of course, that's very controversial. Another very popular one is tied to sensory processes and embodiment. Certainly many aspects of human consciousness centrally involve senses and embodiment. Not present in pure language models, of course, may be present in multimodal models or their successors. World models and self models, many people think these things are required for consciousness, and that language models don't yet have them, or don't yet have sophisticated enough versions. More technically, there's recurrent processing. A number of theories of consciousness postulate that recurrent processing is required for consciousness. And of course, transformers, at least, only have extremely limited recurrent processing. They largely feed forward, which some people think means they lack computational requirements for consciousness. I mentioned the global workspace already. A classic language model in a transformer doesn't seem to have a global workspace. So you might, if you buy that criterion, that's a problem. And some people put weight on a broad cluster of considerations around agency and unity, like, do these language models have fundamental drives or motives of their own? Do they indeed have beliefs of their own? Are they mostly taking on personas rather than having genuine agency of their own? That's a reasonable worry. So I think all of these are at least concerns to take seriously. My own view, at least looking at these 6 or so, is biology, I don't think for various reasons is necessary for consciousness. Even looking at current language models, including, of course, most models these days are multimodal, which gives them a kind of sensory processing. And there are, embodied language models typically controlling virtual bodies or sometimes physical robots, so far limited, but there's a research program there. I think there's at least basic world models in language models. So those criteria have, to some degree, been checked off. Arguably, I think current language models lack robust self models. Most of them lack recurrence. Most of them lack a global workspace. And there's this whole issue of unified agency. But on the other hand, I think for each of these, there's at least a research program of developing these things already, and especially over the next 5 or 10 years. So I mean, there's the whole research program of finding world models in language models, which I think is well advanced. There are people trying to develop Recurrent network-based language models. This is an older piece. There was one just a few weeks ago on LSTM-based language models. That's certainly a research program. A bunch of people developing multimodal language models have been led to postulate something like a global workspace, not necessarily for that reason. For example, here's a nice paper taking the perceiver architecture developed at DeepMind, which actually turns out to have a workspace for integrating between the various different modalities it deals with, which has at least some of the properties of a global workspace. So I think, yes, there are obstacles. On the other hand, yes, there are also programs for overcoming all those obstacles. So at one point I thought about, okay, just say you wanted to give this a numerical analysis in terms of probabilities, and do not take the numbers here very seriously at all, but here's one way to think about it. For each of these 6 factors, they're all reasonably serious factors. It's reasonable at least. I think for each of them, there's a, let's say, 1 in 3 chance that factor could be required for consciousness. If we say that, and if we also say that current pure language models lack those factors, which is plausible in many cases, and that they're independent, then you get your credence in that current pure language models are conscious would be bounded by, I don't know, what's 2/3 to the 6th power? That's 64 divided by 729, just under 10%. So that would bound your probability in current pure language models being consciousness at just under 10%. Of course, that's complicated because, it depends on an independence assumption, which is certainly not true, but that would bring the credence up. On the other hand, there may be other X factors not left here, and that might also bring it down. So, but maybe being somewhere around 10% wouldn't be so unreasonable. Yeah?
David, out of these 6 factors, biology is the only one that definitely won't happen in LLM. So can you explain more why biology is not part of it?
Yeah, in my own work, I've argued against the relevance of biology or at least against the necessity of biology by thinking about gradual replacement scenarios where, you take biological neurons and gradually replace them by silicon equivalents thereof, neuromorphic replacements. And, one version of the thought experiment, first you replace a few neurons, you replace 5% of the brain, 10% of the brain, 50% of the brain, assuming it's possible to actually simulate the neurons well enough. It looks like through this you could eventually be led to a simulation of the brain, which is functionally equivalent. If the other end we postulate is not conscious, then there's some very interesting questions about what happens to consciousness along the way. Does it gradually fade out while the behavior stays the same? That leads to problems. Does it suddenly disappear when you replace a magic neuron? So I've basically used that kind of consideration to argue that it's not all that plausible that biology is required for consciousness. That said, even here I say, look, it's a serious philosophical hypothesis. That argument's not absolutely conclusive. So here I give it a 1 in 3 chance that consciousness requires biology. If you really took that seriously, that, of course, as you say, that's it's a permanent fact that at least anything like current AI systems are not going to have biochemistry. So, that would then say we should have a permanent 1 in 3 credence that AI systems are not conscious. For my part, that would actually be too high. I think the arguments against biology being required are stronger than that. But this is a point of contention in the community. One thing I've thought about, by the way, in this context is how do you distribute your credences here between hypotheses? Everyone's going to have their own, but maybe as a community, we can look at things like surveys of different philosophical views and of different science, the percentage of people that favor different theories, and we can maybe assign collective credences by building on those sociological facts, which is an interesting program. Here I'm just doing something very back of the envelope. Anyway, that's current language models. So you might be reasonable to be fairly low on current language models. But when it comes to future language models, we've seen there's research programs in all these cases for getting beyond these limitations. I mean, we already have extended multimodal language models with sensors and a form, at least, a limited form of embodiment with world models. Self-models are on their way. Recurrence, global workspace, unified goals are either, maybe there are primitive versions of them here and more sophisticated versions plausibly coming within the next 10 years. So just say, in 10 years, we'll have, successors to language models, maybe virtual multimodal agents with all 6 of these features, sorry, all 5, except for biology. And, with some reasonably serious behavioral capacities, like exceeding, say, mouse capacities, I think it'd be reasonable to assign more than 50% chance that we'll have these in 10 years. Then conditional on that, will they be conscious? Well, it's not obvious. There could be other X factors. Biology could be an X factor. But I think, conditional on having this in 10 years, I think it would be reasonable to assign it, at least around a 50% credence that they're conscious or higher, which putting together gives you a credence in that will have AI consciousness in 10 years, bounded below by 25%. Again, the numbers are not to be taken too seriously. Maybe you could redo it and come out at 5 or 10%. But nevertheless, I think, we end up with a serious probability based on this kind of analysis. Of course, there's an awful lot which is very unclear here. So, and the underlying problems include, first problem, we don't understand consciousness. The response to that challenge is try and develop better scientific and philosophical theories of consciousness than the primitive ones we have right now, making this even harder. Of course, we don't really understand what's going on in language models, for which the challenge is better language model interpretability, which I think is an incredibly important project for all kinds of reasons, including this one. I think there's this particular project here, which I think of as interpretability for mental states, looking at the kinds of algorithms that these systems are performing and seeing whether these might satisfy the criteria for having mental states like, believing, desiring, feeling emotion, maybe even being conscious. Right now, interpretability research tends to focus on, do we represent this feature? Do we represent this feature? Whereas this requires us to get down into further questions, like attitudes, like belief, desire, other properties like affect. But I think there's at least a project here. At the very least, behavioral interpretability for these features is a long existing project, and they're actually, philosophical frameworks built around describing mental states to systems based on their behavior. We might want, for various reasons, think behavior is not the purest guide to the mind. So eventually, we might want mathematical computational criteria for consciousness through this interpretability projects, which may require engineering new and more precise concepts of some of these mental categories like belief, desire, and so on, if needed. Brings you back to the kind of eliminative or revisionary materialism that the Churchlands put forward back in the 1980s, saying, "Hey, maybe we'll have to revise our conceptual scheme a little bit to handle these AI systems, but then we'll have something we can work with, and then ultimately apply that regime of interpretability to determine when AI systems have minds and moral status." So I think this is just a really important project for scientists, engineers, philosophers, all to engage with. Anyways, to conclude, questions about AI consciousness are not going away. Within 10 years, even if we don't have human-level AGI, we may well have systems that are serious candidates for consciousness, and I think serious interdisciplinary research is required to clarify criteria for AI consciousness and avoid moral catastrophe. Oh yeah, and my Shiri slide, open questions, they're all open. No one solved any of them, but tractable open questions. We've got a few of those, yeah. Better mathematical specifications of conscious states, figure out more precisely neural correlates of various kinds of conscious states. There's this whole project of AI interpretability for mental states. There's this program of finding a solution to the meta problem, what mechanisms generate our reports of consciousness, and ultimately using all this to formulate some kind of psychophysical laws of consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was very clear. There's one scientific approach that you didn't mention that I think is relevant, particularly relevant to AI, which is the sort of Eva Jablonka, Peter Godfrey Smith view about the evolution of a plausible evolutionary story for consciousness. And that doesn't make biology the relevant marker. It makes having organisms that can go out into the world and interact with other organisms, roughly, like what happens in the Cambrian. Because that's when you start seeing things like brains, which people have thought of as closely related to consciousness, and plausibly things like valence having a perspective. And I'm wondering what you think about that and how that would, that's clearly not at all what LLMs are like, but it could be what an LLM informed robot is like, for example.
Yeah, on the face of it, these are programs that give you a relatively low bar for consciousness, at least within the biological world, and that I think on both of these views, most non-human animals come out being conscious. For Jablonka, it's all a matter of very simple associative learning mechanisms. Prima facie, very easy to implement in an AI system. Peter, I don't think has a really specific claim about what's required for consciousness, but he does think it's something very simple that simple sensory and affective mechanisms could have. So conditional on those things, I would think that, prima facie, it'd be quite easy to develop AI systems. Probably some existing, say, reinforcement learning AI systems are going to have these properties already, and conditional on that, AI consciousness, at least of a primitive kind, would be easy. Now, that's complicated by the fact that, at least for Peter, he thinks biology is required for consciousness, and he thinks a silicon simulation of these things will not do the job. And in fact, we had a back and forth recently in the journals where he critiqued my book Reality Plus, where I argued that biology doesn't matter. So insofar as you have a theory of consciousness where biology is required, maybe Damasio is not far away from this either, then that's going to put you in that portion of credence space where AI consciousness is much less likely.
And I'm not sure it's biology. Biology is part of it, but it's also this sense of complicated interactions with the external world, which is a different criterion, which you mentioned with embodiment, but it's not just having a body, it's having a particular set of relationships to an external world, like being able to revise your beliefs about it, for example.
Yeah, so social embodiment is one aspect of this. Interacting with other beings. Epistemological engagement is one part of it. I think of that as very tied to the world model aspect and so on. But you probably ultimately want to distinguish between all these different aspects of embodiment and think about them separately. There.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really interesting talk.
Sorry, where are you?
Oh, I'm here. Hi, sorry. Hi. Yeah, thanks so much. Really enjoyed the talk. I was curious a little bit more about the argument against biology being necessary for consciousness. And in particular, I guess I want to make a distinction between biology as in, cells and so forth versus biological structure. If I understood your argument correctly, it's if you replace one neuron with silicon and you keep going up, right? It makes sense that maybe that we would still consider conscious because it's sort of like a ship of Theseus analogy. I'm wondering, do you think that still applies if we're looking at the sort of systems we have now where we don't have guarantees on the subcomponents being built up, having that sort of biological structure to them, right? Like a transformer looks nothing like the brain on the inside. Do you think it's the literal, the fleshy bits of biology that are necessary, or the structure of biology, even if necessary to be imitated in silico for consciousness to exist?
Yeah, you're right that a transformer is not at all neuromorphic, at least above a level of the artificial neuron. So I think you wouldn't get much direct support for transformers being conscious based on them being brain-like. The way I'm thinking of the dialectic here is rather there's a view out there that says biology or biochemistry is required for consciousness. No system could be conscious without literally having, relevant carbon-based processes. Then we just need to look at one case to potentially refute that. The case, say, of a neuromorphic brain, a silicon system with components that replicate the function of the biological components. If we can make the case, I try to argue just that system is conscious, then that will suggests that the claim that biology is required for consciousness is wrong. Now, it doesn't automatically tell you that it doesn't tell you which silicon systems will be conscious. We'll just have gotten, one kind potentially in the door. But I'm thinking that, okay, once we've, that will at least have removed the in-principle objection that consciousness requires biology. Now, maybe there'll be further related objections, which is consciousness will need to be brain-like in some weaker way, like in some functional way, and that transformers won't be brain-like in that way. And I take it, recurrence versus feed-forward is just one among many versions of that objection. So those need to be taken one at a time then, I think.
Great talk. Thank you very much. I had one low-level technical question, one higher-level sort of conceptual metaphor question. So the low-level question is, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on what you see as being the argument that transformers as such don't have a global workspace, but that the perceiver does. Because some people might think that, oh, the residual stream in a transformer is doing something global workspace-like, where it's integrating information from a bunch basically everything that's come earlier in time. And, in a multimodal transformer, of course, it could be integrating information across modalities too. The higher level question is just, when I hear these arguments, I sometimes think back. I tend to believe that language models are also not conscious. But when I hear these arguments, I think back to the people who were arguing against powered flight shortly before it was achieved. And this gets talked about a lot with AI systems, right? There were people who were like, oh, it's going to be 1,000,000 years till anyone develops flight. You could never do it without wings that flap, whatever, right? So there were a lot of criteria that people thought of as being necessary for flight because those were the examples of heavier than air flying systems that we had. Then suddenly this new class of systems came along and proved them wrong. So how many of these arguments do you think are based on human sort of inability to be very imaginative and to think of things that could be done in a different way than the way that we've seen them done in the past?
Yeah, you're probably right that in retrospect, at least some of these criteria are going to look very parochial and chauvinistic. Maybe they're going to at best be criteria for human-like consciousness, and once you recognize the space of all possible consciousness, some of them won't look as serious. That said, epistemologically, in coming to figure out from our position, from our very uncertain position, which systems are conscious and which ones are not, you might say, okay, when it comes to consciousness, we really have one clear data point, which is humans or maybe oneself. That's the one case of a system one knows is conscious. So it's not totally unreasonable to have higher confidence that a system will be conscious, the more it's like a human, or the more it's like oneself. That's merely a kind of an epistemological claim from our current state of evidence. It may be that systems very unlike us can be conscious, but from our point of view, it may at least be uncertain. And yeah, the question about transformers is interesting. I'm certainly open to the idea that if you poke around in the architecture of transformers, you get some kind of global workspace. I mean, the residual stream, I don't know. There are like so many residual streams, right? So which one of them is going to be the global workspace? Whereas something like this perceiver I/O architecture has this one clear element, which is a relatively low capacity workspace for integrating the products of these different multimodal streams, which is closer to the classic workspace postulated by Bars, DeHaene, and others. But yeah, I'm certainly not opposed to finding them in transformers.
Doris here.
Okay, thank you so much. So the hard problem is how does subjective experience arise from a physical system? And then all these different theories of consciousness, they all exist at one level of abstraction, right? Like a global workspace, it makes sense if you regard the neurons as neurons and not as quarks or something, right? So you have to think about it at that network level. And so I feel like the hard problem arises because it's like intrinsically for the system itself, there should be a correct level of abstraction of perceiving itself, and that it's not perceiving itself as at the level for perceiving itself at the level of global workspace, and that just seems like our current way of thinking about science is that you can look at a system at any level and they all fit together, and you can just choose if you want to be a molecular biologist or a physicist or a sociologist. So do you feel like you need any new concept in physics for explaining consciousness?
I mean, we might, and I wouldn't rule it out. And I've actually thought about connections between quantum mechanics and consciousness, which there are connections there to be drawn if you want to. Although they're very speculative, and the quantum mechanical approaches we have right now to consciousness are not terribly convincing. But yeah, there is this general question of levels. What is the right level for thinking about consciousness? Is it something like, is it a deeply subcellular level? Is it the neural level? Is it a, go on?
Not how we think about consciousness, but how can a system know in itself, like what level to think about its computations at? Like that's because that's what consciousness is, right?
Thinking about yourself. I think of thinking about yourself as one aspect of consciousness, but that's, I would call that self-consciousness or reflective consciousness.
Right. Your brain, like, you know that you're not just, your brain's not just a bunch of molecules. Like it's regarding itself as this computational system that's extracting this information from these particular photoreceptors. Like there's a level of interpretation. It's choosing a level of interpretation of the physical system.
So we just say you've got a very simple system that feels pain or sees red. I think that a more complex system, which has the ability to reflect on this, could then go on to draw some conclusions from this, like, oh my God, I have these amazing properties, and here is what this says about me. I would think that you could, in my view, you could have the simple subjective experience without this striking you in any particular reflective way. You know, if you tie consciousness too closely to how the system strikes you, then you get led down the path to something like Graziano's consciousness as your self models, which I don't think is that's not what you intend here, but rather consciousness is tied to some epistemological impact.
We have a last question here. I'm sorry, we have to
Okay, just related to Doris's question, maybe, but it's about this hard question of consciousness, as you said. But just a very narrow version of it. In your replacement argument, do you feel that it addressed the hard question of consciousness as well? This reduction that you gave?
Not really, no. I think of this as just a question about the distribution of consciousness, which systems are conscious and which ones aren't. And this is very conditional on the assumption that we have at least one case of consciousness. You know, a human brain seems to support consciousness. And then conditional on that, it argues that something that shares its functional properties will be conscious. But then it does nothing to explain why either of those systems is conscious in the first place. I mean, I think it's very deeply mysterious how an AI system could be conscious, but I find it equally mysterious that a brain could be conscious. And this is just using an argument from one case to the other case, so it doesn't solve the hard problem.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.